All right, thanks again for tuning in this week. We have two speakers that are going to be talking today. We have Andrew Gallo from George Washington and Lenny Giuliano from Juniper. And this is going to be an all things old are new again sort of talk, where we all learn the magic of multicast and how it is still around, still a thing, and still a very usable component that we need to be supporting within our networks. And hopefully they'll enlighten us on how some new things are trying to utilize this as we go forward, as we all shelter in place still. So I will turn it over to Lenny, who's going to get us started. You're still muted, Lenny, if you're trying to talk.
Sorry. Thanks, Jason.
There we go.
So we're talk about today is what we're calling multicast to the grandma, which is it's about kind of the next generation of multicast. So what is multicast to the grandma? Since about the late 90s, internet multicast, and I'm going to talk specifically about internet multicast, not necessarily walled garden multicast or enterprise level multicast, but internet, interdomain, over the top, whatever you want to call it, multicast has really only been available to, a privileged few, primarily the types of people on this call. What we've been working on more recently is, all right, how do we make it available to everyone? How do we make it so ubiquitous that everyone can use it? And also what I'm going to talk about today is not just a hope for a distant future, but I'm going to demonstrate that this actually works today. You could start watching it, you could use it. The days of looking at coffee pot cams on your, Spark station in 1997 with SDR, and you couldn't use it anywhere else on the planet. Those days are over. You can literally start watching content, multicast content that is on the M-bone, the multicast backbone, principally I2. You can watch that anywhere on the internet now. All right, so the first question most people have is why multicast? The internet's working just fine. Depending on the numbers you see, somewhere between 60 and 70% or so of the internet traffic is video. Pretty much all of it is unicast video, seems to be working fine. Why would we need multicast? It's probably the most obvious question. So let's just start with the numbers. High def bit rates, and these bit rates vary, but a high def bit rate is 4 to 8 megs. 4K jumps up about 4 to 5 times that, 35 to 45 megs. 8K, double of that. And virtual reality, the numbers are all over the place, but I've seen them as low as a half a gig per second to 5.2 gigabits per second. So things have been working just fine, but the bit rates have been comparatively low and the number of streams have been low. But as you can see, the laws of large numbers eventually may begin to take over here. To give you some perspective, every year Akamai announces that they've broken a traffic record. Their most recent announcement was back in April, where they hit 167 terabits. Now, to my knowledge, I think Akamai is the largest CDN, if not, they're certainly one of the biggest. And they account for 15 to 30% of all web traffic. Now, if you were just to take that number, 167 terabits, which is, again, the largest amount of CDN traffic on internet history, by how many 4K streams would that come to? That would be 4.2 million simultaneous 4K viewers. That's all it would take is 4.2 million simultaneous viewers of content set a new internet traffic record. Now, to give you some perspective, 4.2 may seem like a lot, but that would correspond to the 117th most popular TV show. So that's all it would take. If the 117th most popular television show from 2017, 2018 were to broadcast over the internet, what would it take to break an internet traffic record? So, what we've been doing today is, I would call it brute force unicast. We just send a separate stream to every viewer, right? And the question is, can brute force unicast keep up? Well, the average audience for an NFL game is 15 million viewers. That's not a Super Bowl. It's not the playoff game. It's not Monday Night Football. That's an average game, 15 million viewers. Take 15 million viewers, and if all of them were watching it 4K simultaneously over the internet, that would be 600 terabits, right? That's 5x or so the large, and that's just one game. It goes up from there. The Super Bowl has about 100 million viewers. The World Cricket had 200 to 300. Cricket World Cup had 200 to 300 million, and the World Cup, most recent World Cup, had 500 million viewers simultaneously. Also, if you look at kind of the evolution of cord cutting, live linear television is kind of the last frontier. You know, it began with things like Netflix and Hulu and YouTube, you know, maybe 10 years ago. And it was about on demand, watching movies on demand. But this is kind of the last frontier. If you talk to people who still have television, you say, why did you not cut the cord? Almost all of them will tell you, I want to watch sports. I want to watch network television. You know, a lot of people will say live linear is dead. It's not dead yet. It's still around. It's still kicking. And there's just certain content that people want to watch live. Moreover, it's live streaming is actually trending. So we live in an era of fake news, of low trust. Typical corporate communications looks like it was ripped straight out of Orwell. And people prefer people with audience have shown that the spontaneous and uneditable nature of live is perceived as more authentic, and it actually drives deeper emotional engagement than on-demand content. And marketing folks have noticed this. Viewers will spend 8 times longer with live video content than on demand. Live video shows better ROI. And it's actually the fastest growing component of online video. Also, recent events with the current pandemic has shown the need for solutions that enable people to gather virtually, whether it's distance learning. A lot of the folks here are at universities, and you're discovering that it's been thrust upon you 2-3 months ago. Getting a virtual distant learning environment at scale. Things like worship services, movie watch parties, drinks with friends, even brown bag lunches like today are demonstrating the need for live events, live streaming events. Just one other digression about internet multicast. I compare it a lot to V6. I would say they're related. They're kind of like technological cousins. In that any argument you can make for or against V6 applies equally well to multicast. So there are some folks out there who say we don't need V6 or we don't need multicast, right? We have NAT. And the multicast people say we have CDNs. We don't need it. There are others, the advocates, that say, oh, it's absolutely needed. On the V6 side, we have this, V4 address exhaustion. And in the meantime, on the multicast side, they say, the inefficiency, duplicated video streams is incredibly inefficient. Both suffer the all or nothing problem, which is kind of the fundamental problem that multicast has always had. V6 has this same problem. I'm gonna dive into what that means. And both require protocols or extensions of old ones, whether it be routing protocols, principally signaling protocols. Both were born in the 90s. They kind of struggled through adolescence. V6 is certainly doing better than than multicast cousin, but I would still say that V6 is kind of underemployed. It's kind of living at home with its parents, who are kind of a little nervous about failure to launch issues. And both require faith in the unseen. And in that way, neither V6 nor multicast actually do anything. What they do is they enable big things. They're just kind of an infrastructure thing that in and of themselves are useless, but it enables things that weren't possible otherwise. So live linear is here to stay. And the problem is, IP unicast is pretty much suited well for just about every, is well suited for just about every traffic type except multi-destination traffic. This is why multicast was created, 2.5 decades ago, to solve this very problem. But what went wrong? Why did internet multicast never take off the way we'd hoped? So to understand that, let's go back to the beginning. So in the beginning, there was Unicast. And imagine you have one viewer of a stream of data, and you have another interested viewer for the same exact data stream. And as you have more and more viewers, you have to send n number of streams for n number of viewers, right? And this gets expensive at the origin. You need a server capable and powerful enough to send n number of streams, and you need enough bandwidth to send n number of streams, right? So along comes multicast, and the way multicast works is the network intelligently determines where are the interested receivers, and it builds a tree back toward the source in a way that no link carries more than one copy of the traffic. Data is replicated in the network, but not duplicated at the source. So it is the most efficient way to deliver this content. But there's a problem with multicast. And that is the internet is not just some single monolithic network. It's actually a network of networks. Some are multicast enabled, most are not. So if you have content, you have a source on a multicast enabled network with multicast enabled content, but you have a receiver in a unicast only network, the result is unbounded sadness. Sadness on the part of the receiver who can't access content, and sadness on the part of the source who has content, is multicast enabled, has an interested receiver, but can't reach them. This is the all or nothing problem. In order for multicast to work, every single link, every single layer 3 hop, every single router and firewall interface between source and receiver must be enabled for multicast. It must be running a multicast routing protocol. Technically speaking, for all intents and purposes, they must be running PIM or something, or a multicast routing protocol like it. That is the all or nothing problem. That is the fundamental problem why multicast has not made it on the internet, is to get, when something is useless until everybody turns it on, it's really, really difficult to get everybody to turn something on at the same time. And that's what the V6 people have been seeing for, for the same amount of time. All right, so what do we do? And this is where CDNs come up. And there's different CDN models, but one of the more common models is these CDN caches. These boxes are deployed throughout the network. The origin will send a stream to one, who will replicate it and send it to the others. And from there, they handle local receivers. So it's almost as good as multicast, and it just works. So if we compare these, unicast, CDNs, and multicast, and we look at cost as a function of audience size. Now we're looking at this from the perspective of the content provider. We see unicast is simple. It's a simple linear line. You have 100 viewers, you have to send 100 streams. Your cost is pretty simple. With CDNs, you still do have a per user cost, but it's much lower. The slope of that line, the cost of that per user cost drops. So the slope of that is much smaller. But do notice that there is an initial cost, and that's the initial cost to deploy these CDN boxes. You got to power them, you got to plug them into network ports. By comparison, multicast, whether you have 1 viewer or 1 billion viewers, the cost from the perspective of the content provider is constant. So one thing to keep in mind, CDNs certainly help, but they don't eliminate the brute force unicast problem. They just distribute it. So what's new? Internet multicast, like I said, it's been around since the 90s, hasn't gained much traction. Why should things be any different now? And there's a few things that have changed. And this is kind of the big thing that I would say to any folks out there who, quit paying attention to multicast 10, 15 years ago. I'm here to tell you things are different now. The biggest, one of the big differences is a thing called ASM deprecation. Essentially, one of the big reasons people didn't turn on multicast was because the protocols, specifically PIM, but there's others, MSDP, they're really complex. They're, difficult to troubleshoot, difficult to manage, a lot of weird corner cases in the case of PIM. MSDP has its scaling issues. It's kind of a pain in the neck. And the perceived cost of deploying these things didn't outweigh the benefits to the people who didn't turn it on. Well, for those of you who know much about multicast, That's because it uses a thing called any source multicast. An original was it would equally handle one-to-many and many-to-many streams. And so most of the complexity of multicast routing protocols of PIM was to make sure that many-to-many worked. Well, it turns out the killer app for multicast is one-to-many. In fact, many-to-many is a security hole. So this was kind of designed into the protocols to make it work. And it turns out that when anybody can stream to a group and everybody's going to get it, that's kind of a, a DOS attack, a DOS vector. So this benefit that contributes about, I would say, at least 90% of the complexity of the routing protocols is totally unnecessary. And that's where source-specific multicast comes in. With source-specific multicast, it's one-to-many. You join only a stream, a multicast group from a single source. So essentially, this draft, the deprecate ASM draft, it's actually at IESG, last call, it's in the RFC editor queue right now. It's about to become an RFC. It basically says no more ASM. If you're gonna do interdomain multicast, just do SSM only. And I2 actually applied this. And last year, they eliminated ASM. They got rid of their rendezvous points. They got rid of their MSDP. And their multicast deployment is SSM only. This eliminates 90% of the complexity. Right now, when you run SSM only, PIM is now as complex as LDP. And LDP is about as simple as a routing protocol can be. Nobody has ever complained that LDP is too complex. PIM, I would say, is on par with LDP in an SSM only mode. So that's out there, that's big. The second thing is overlay networking. And specifically it's AMT, automatic multicast tunneling. I'm gonna kind of do a deep dive into AMT. But AMT solves, and overlay networking generally, solves the fundamental all or nothing problem of multicast. And I'm gonna explain how. Also, when I started in this business, tunneling was seen as a suboptimal hack that you worked hard to get rid of. Now, all of a sudden, tunneling is fashionable. As long as you don't call it tunneling, just call it overlay networking, and all the cool kids are doing it these days. So, an important thing to keep in mind, what's new? All of the pieces are in place for a working solution today. This is, again, I'm not talking about something that someday, if only we could do blah, blah, blah. The architecture, the technology, the tools are all in place. As Dino Farinacci said, it's not a technology problem, it's just a lack of product problem these days. And that's why I'm talking to you over Zoom using Unicast and not Zoom using Multicast. So let me dive into AMT, what it is and how it works. So imagine we have a multicast-enabled service provider, say I2, Internet 2 backbone, or Internet 2 backbone. And imagine you have a content owner that is multicast-enabled. So somebody plugs into I2, and you have a local multicast, a multicast-enabled local provider. There aren't many, but think universities. In this way, you have a bunch of interested receivers. They receive the content natively, just the way multicast has always worked. So that's what's always worked. That's the M-bone, the multicast-enabled part of the internet. It's probably 1 to 2% of the internet is multicast. The RNE networks. All right, so imagine you have a unicast-only network. This is the more common case. This is the 99% case. And that is a network that is not multicast-enabled. And you have an interested receiver. And he tries to send an IGMP report to his local router, and nothing happens. So it times out after a short period of time. However, it has this special thing called an AMT Gateway, and that's the client that sits on a laptop, a smartphone, a smart TV, whatever. It's a client. It's a special thin client software that has the ability to discover an AMT relay. And a relay is the server. It's the tunnel server that sits at the border of the multicast-enabled network. So he will dynamically build a UDP tunnel, an AMT UDP tunnel, send an IGMP report through that UDP tunnel, and the relay will now send a PIM join, receive the content natively, and then tunnel it out to that end user over that dynamically built AMT tunnel. As you have more users, they set up separate tunnels. And so now, one thing to keep in mind, AMT is not a destination. This isn't the finishing point. it's really a transition mechanism. It's a stopover. Now, those local service providers that previously had no reason to turn on multicast, now they have a reason. So that was one of the other problems of multicast, the chicken and egg. There was no content because there was no audience. And there was no audience because there was no content. Well, we solved the chicken, AMT solves the chicken and egg problem by saying, we have an audience, it's the whole internet. So now there's a reason, you know, once you start seeing gobs and gobs of tunneled traffic, a service provider now has a business case to actually turn multicast on natively. So that's kind of the technology. How does it work? What's next? And kind of, you know, we talk about, you know, world domination for multicast in 5 steps. So the first step, and I'm going to dig into each of those, where we are at each steps. First step is AMT relays. The second step is the AMT Gateway Implementations. The third step is a portal for content, finding content discovery. Fourth step is off-net sourcing. The fifth step, you know, every plan needs 5 steps. What is that? And that, of course, step 5 is profit. There are currently, the first relay was deployed at Thomas Jefferson High School, which is, you know, a magnet high school in Northern Virginia, right outside DC. They actually have a 10 gig pipe to Internet 2. And they, one of their students there, William Zhang, for his senior project, decided to run the first public AMT relay on the M-bone. Subsequently, George Washington University has deployed 2, and Andrew's going to kind of talk about that and give some details on how, you know, what that looks like and how he's how things are running there. We need more relays. I spoke at the Tech Exchange in New Orleans a couple months ago, and there were a number of folks who were, a number of folks reached out and said they were interested in running relays. A relay, if you have an MX router, it costs you nothing but 4 lines of config. There's no additional hardware. There's no software licenses. If you have, you know, a Juniper MX router, it's, you know, totally free to enable as a relay. I'm told Cisco, I'm not the Cisco guy, but as I understand it, Cisco also has AMT code. So if you have Cisco, I believe ASRs, you know, reach out to your Cisco folks and ask them about AMT if you're interested. The way if in case you're wondering, you know, one relay was easy. What do you do when you have 2 and 3? How do you pick one? The way we're doing it is with DNS. You know, the Jeff Houston approach, you know, let's just throw it in a DNS. So we have multiple A records for the same fully qualified domain name. And the way it works is we do things, we learned our lesson. Trying to put all this complexity into the network never works. The application layer is where the richness of functionality can be. That's where we need to move all the complexity and all the functionality in there. So relay resilience is handled by the application layer. So we've developed, I'll talk a little bit about VLC in a second, but the VLC application that takes advantage of this, essentially it will do a lookup on the relay. It has hard-coded this relay in there. It will receive back multiple A records, and it will, an ordered list of multiple A records, and it'll just go down one after another until it receives content. So it'll try the first relay. If it gets nothing back, it'll try the second relay and so forth. So we application as opposed to the network layer. Now, that's not optimality. You won't necessarily get the closest relay. We're not there yet. That's kind of a TBD. That's kind of the next thing to work on. But you know, it'll probably use DNS, and you know, I've got some ideas as to how to solve this problem, but we don't need to solve this one yet. So after William deployed this first AMT relay, we discovered, well, there's no AMT gateway implementations out there. There had been some stuff, but it had, you know, they were 7, 8 years old and had kind of fallen apart. That wasn't supported, the gateway implementations out there. So we started working on, you know, the goal was multicast to the browser. And unfortunately, the browsers are pretty well locked down. So last summer, Natalie Landsberg, who at the time she was a student at NC State, She wrote an AMT Gateway Implementation for VLC. Subsequently, Wayne Brasem from Juniper helped out and kind of enhanced it. And the two of them worked in tandem to get that deployed. It's now available in mainline VLC code in 4.0. You can go download it right now and check it out and use it. VLC is great because it has always supported multicast pretty well, and it's pretty ubiquitous. It may have support for more transcoders than anything else. It's an excellent piece of software. It's fairly widely deployed, but where we really want to be is multicast to the browser. And actually, Jake Holland from Akamai is working right now in the MBOND working group to, he has a number of drafts to make multicast safe for browsers, to add the authentication, add the circuit breakers, add the flow control that will make the folks at places like Chrome and Firefox give it the thumbs up to say, okay, we'll allow this in the browsers. Because currently today, the browsers are very UDP unfriendly. All right, so step 3 is a multicast portal. And this more recently, thanks to the COVID pandemic, there was another enterprising young student at Thomas Jefferson High School, Lauren Delwich, decided to write an app that basically combed the entire MBONE for all the multicast streams. It looks for streams over, I think, something like 50 packets per second or 100 packets per second, with the assumption, and we want to ignore that. We're looking for video content. So kind of a crude assumption that anything greater than 50 packets per, or 100 packets per second is multicast or is video. So she took a script that was actually written by William Zhang that went to the I2 router looking glass, and every hour it basically did a show multicast route detail on all the I2 routers, looked at streams that had a packet rate over that threshold, and then populated that on a web page that you could then click on, and it would launch VLC. Pretty impressive. One of the most impressive parts of this was Lauren is a sophomore in high school. I don't know about you guys, but I was not doing anything like this when I was a sophomore. So pretty amazing stuff. It's really cool. I encourage everybody, click on this link, and you will see live streaming multicast content on the MBONE, and you'll be able to watch it anywhere on the internet. You can also populate it with, if we have new streams, if you're aware of a stream that's not out there, because obviously it only discovers these streams based on people who've joined stuff already. So if you have new content that people aren't aware of, you can actually submit and post, add streams to that portal. Off-net sourcing. So step 4, this is the big step. This is where things really begin to change. And this is where I think multicast can have a huge impact. So basically what AMT allows is off-net receiving. That is, you have a receiver who's sitting on a unicast only network trying to receive multicast content. But what if you have an off-net source? What if you have somebody with a smartphone who wants to just hit record and just start streaming something live that can be received by an arbitrarily large audience? A million people could be watching the stream from somebody's smartphone, right? A million simultaneous viewers. How do you do that? So we'll call this off-net sourcing. And this is where I think multicast can really do something that nothing else can do these days. No other technologies can support. That is, the ability to send live to an arbitrarily large audience from something like a smartphone. So the way this would work is users on the unicast only network can stream to some box, some magic box that translates the content. Either takes it from a unicast stream and turns it into multicast, or in the case of, we were actually able to get this working using a thing called a tunneling technology called Lisp. and we demonstrated at IETF last year, somebody with a smartphone built a Lisp tunnel dynamically to a Lisp translation router that was sitting in the M-bone, and was able to transmit multicast packets from a smartphone on a unicast and only network that was receivable on the M-bone. So kind of two ways to approach this. One is with Lisp, one is with, a unicast and multicast translator. The next, one of the things that, somebody had been working on was getting a streaming live video from an Android camera using multicast over this Lisp tunnel and getting it out on the M-bone. There was some progress made, but there's still a lot of work to be done there. So the idea is how to get sources on unicast only networks to be able to transmit data that becomes available as multicast streams. Still needs work. This is something that we could definitely use a lot of help with. So how does this all work? I just kind of described it verbally, but kind of putting a picture of how all these pieces would fit together. So we have the internet, the big I internet, and here is the M-bone, which is again the multicast enabled portion of the internet. That's essentially I2. So if you have a multicast source and a native receiver on net, that just works natively as it has for 20 some years. Now imagine we have an off-net receiver. How do we get content there? Well, we deploy the AMT relays at the border. We send the content natively to those relays, and from there it gets tunneled via UDP, unicast, over AMT to the receivers. Now we have an off-net source. How does this work? Well, we've gotten it working with Lisp. We have this Lisp translation router that builds a dynamic tunnel from the source via Lisp. The source, if it can transmit multicast packets, which Android and iPhone supposedly can do, the Lisp translation router will take it and insert it into the multicast and the M-bone, and from there it can go natively to native receivers on net and via AMT to off-net receivers. So with that, I'll turn things over to Andrew.
Thank you. So yeah, there's a lot of really good content there, and I want to stress, just as Lenny's mentioned a couple of times, this is something that we're running on our production network. So why Internet 2? Why this group? Really, as we talked about before, Internet 2 is probably the largest multicast enabled network and has a lot of associated networks that are interdomain multicast. So there's a lot of multicast knowledge in the community. We like to play with new things, test out new things, and this is really what the network is for. There's always been, I wouldn't say a little bit of tension, but a little bit of question is the Internet 2 network itself a test bed, or is it a service to allow other research traffic to flow? And with AMT, this is a case where it is production-ready code, and it is a production-ready service. And we'll talk about the test bed. Lenny, if you want to go to the next slide, please. So Lenny approached us probably a couple of years ago and said, let's put this AMT code on your router, not the code, the config. First, I was a little nervous, but it's really straightforward. It really is just 4 lines of code in the routing protocol section of the router. You basically tell it, become an AMT relay, use this address, and that's really about it. We had put it immediately or directly at first on our production MX480, and it worked without problem. After a code upgrade, there was something in Junos that broke the relay function. So we temporarily put it on an MX80 that sat next to the 480. And that adjunct is still there, but we've since moved back or re-enabled the relay after a second code upgrade that fixed the bug. But none of this was service affecting. It didn't affect any other protocols. There wasn't any negative impact. This was an AMT bug. And just like we run into bugs on just about any other protocol, this was identified and fixed, and now we're back running on the 480. The reason we're leaving the MX80 in there is I'll probably take it out soon, but what's interesting to note is Thomas Jefferson's, I believe, was on an MX80 as well. These are the lowest capacity MX platform, and these guys can do it as well. So this topology or this testbed shows you can run it either directly on your backbone routers, or if for whatever reason you didn't want to do that, you can put in adjunct routers that sit right next to your backbone. Part of the test bed, we needed some additional content. So I got a bunch of videos, open source, or at least a Creative Commons license, and sourced them with VLC. As with all good multicast testing and discussions, Big Buck Bunny is part of the mix. This was, for me, probably the hardest part of the test bed. For some reason, I had trouble figuring out all the different options in VLC to properly source content. Once we figured out the command lines to do that, videos showing, high-def videos showing perfectly. As Lenny mentioned before, Lauren wrote a really great website to make finding and then launching and watching the content much easier. Prior to this website, you used to have to put in the AMT URLs into VLC's open network streams dialog. Certainly not difficult, certainly not for this crowd, but as we discussed it with more audiences, want to demonstrate it, this website became much easier, and you should be able to launch VLC directly from this web page. You could hit the next slide, please. This is what the topology looks like. Pretty straightforward. On the left side, you've got the native multicast network, and you see Thomas Jefferson's MX80. They're connected through Maria to get to Internet 2 on native multicast. And above that is CAAREN's MX480, directly connected to Internet 2. There's some existing multicast content through George Mason University and NASA as well. And then also CAAREN's multicast source. For access to the commercial internet, Thomas Jefferson is using Cogent. We're using RCN. And that's how, if you watch this on Unicast network, that's the path you'll be taking. So if you try this at home, you download the nightly VLC, and you're most likely going to be behind a residential NAT router, and you'll go through your provider, you'll hit one of the relays, and the relay will, on your behalf, join the multicast stream, encapsulate it, and send it as an AMT stream to you. Now, we talked about this gateway function being built into VLC, and that's great for this phase of the technology. It's also possible that VLC, or I'm sorry, the relay can be put in other locations. As Lenny said, there's work being done to get it directly into the browser, which might make it easier to consume content, but it's potentially also, there's nothing that prevents it, and in some cases, some of the documentations from other vendors talk about having that relay function exist in other networking elements. You could imagine that this might exist on a residential router or your home router access point, and that could join them, do the AMT for you. Right now, I'm not aware of any, but there's no reason that that couldn't happen. Lenny, if you want to go to the next slide, please. A ladder diagram of what happens when a client joins a stream. We talked a little bit about this before. There's a quick three-way handshake where the gateway introduces itself to the relay. It says, I want to be a client of your relay. Once that three-way handshake completes, the client or the gateway sends all its IGMP traffic inside an AMT tunnel. The relay decapsulates it and joins the group on your behalf. And then upon receiving that traffic, encapsulates it and sends it UDP unicast to the gateway. let's see, there was one other thing I wanted to. Yeah. So next slide, please. So that's really, it's really that straightforward and that simple. There's still some work to be done. You can certainly download and test the code. In-browser content, more relays for more capacity, and certainly more sources. Right now, like I said, I'm originating 3 different streams, Big Buck Bunny, Elephant Stream, and Syntel. George Mason has a bunch of mostly NSF videos, and there's some NASA content as well. A couple other.
Yes, I was just, yes, sorry. I would just highlight that. Like the thing that we need most right now is content drives everything. Like if you don't have interesting content, nobody cares. If you have interesting content, that can drive everything. So if you have, you know, interesting content, live streaming stuff, we'd love to have you, you know, send us your content and get it out there. The more things we, not a lot of content out there. You know, the more that we can get out there, the more interesting, the more people will use it, the more, you know, it will get used. And just to, you know, highlight, if this sounds interesting and fun, there's lots more work to be done. Like I said, the work that Jake is doing at IETF is incredibly valuable for the in-browser implementation, multicast the browser stuff. We could use more relays. 3 is good enough for now, but we want way more than that. So anybody out there within, you know, I can give you the config for the MXs. Talk to your Cisco guys to get the config for. If you've got, you know, grad students who are looking for something cool to work on, send them our way. We'd love to have them involved. We'd love to get more folks engaged here. Here's some, you know, just some references to take a look at. We have a Slack group. If you're interested in joining, this is where all our discussion goes. Please let Andrew or me know, and we'll add you to the Slack group. And Andrew, if you have anything else, I'm done. If I'm ready for questions. Anything else you want to cover?
Just one last thought. As was mentioned previously, right now we're doing everything brute force unicast, and the challenge has always been, well, unicast is good enough, we can scale it, even if it's expensive. If you take a look at who's writing and who's interested in the AMT material, Akamai's name is all over it. So they're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, CDN, and they're interested in this technology. So I think we need to take a second look at multicast, and this service, the automatic multicast tunneling, allows us to walk it through the unicast only networks and really solve that that islanding problem we talked about before. Thank you.
Sure. So Jason, happy to have, if there's any, I haven't been watching, so if there's any questions, be happy to take them.
Sure. Thank you guys for doing this. Great stuff. So there were a couple of comments in there that have self-answered. The first question that I can see that I didn't think there was an answer for, is there anything in AMT that is not IP version agnostic?
Is that a way of saying?
So we may need Michael to clarify on that one. You still there, Lenny? We may have lost you.
So I'll try and answer, because it's one of the first things I asked when we started doing this, and the embarrassing answer is no. Right now it's V4 transport as the outer tunnel, and it is something I poke at Lenny quite frequently and say, why not? Especially because we make the comparisons to the growing pains of the protocols. But the short answer, Michael, unfortunately, is it's V4 now.
Okay. We're getting some audio loss from you, Lenny.
Oh, sorry.
Guess we should be using multicast.
Yeah. This might be more of a Wi-Fi problem here where I am. I'm in a remote place. So, but the short answer is so I just heard the tail end of Andrew's question, but the protocol itself is V6 capable. It was AMT was specified to work equally well with V4.
Okay.
Build
and
implementations for V6.
Okay.
Yeah, so there's no V6 implementations out there, but it can be done if someone wants.
Okay. People have answered questions about where they can find. So people have answered the questions about where you can find the VLC builds. So certainly look into that. There is one question here. I guess it's more of a commentary here about YouTube folks, if they're looking into it. And then some questions here about how content providers can be motivated to use something like this. E.g., will they be able to get paid if they support something like this? I don't know if you guys want to wade into that at all.
I would say it's no different than Unicast. So the first question about YouTube, I have spoken to folks at Google. YouTube, though, hasn't been terribly engaged in this most recent efforts, but we would welcome anybody who's interested in working with us. One of the things that we've, a lot of the multicast efforts initially were about going to the big guys. So for many years, and I spent many years myself working with service providers trying to talk to them about, why don't you go native? Why don't you turn on multicast? Why don't you use it more? This is kind of a, I got enough dents in my head to basically give up on that process and say, let's start from bottom up instead of a top down. So let's build an architecture. Let's get something working. Let's get some content out there. Let's get people excited about it. And that's kind of, the thought process with what we're doing here. But we would welcome anybody, who'd love to have the YouTube folks working on this. I think this would work perfectly with YouTube, with Facebook Live, with, you name it, any kind of content that's live streaming, Amazon, Hulu TV, Amazon Prime Video, you name it, it's useful. So I forget what the rest of the other question was.
I've got a comment about whether or not content providers will be wanting to adopt this. And this is kind of far out there. I've raised this with the folks on the Slack channel and even reached out to a contact that I have at PBS. As ATSC 3.0 gets rolled out, and I believe the first production service is being done in Portland now, ATSC 3.0 for broadcast television, over-the-air television, is an IP technology. And so my question, and I can't find anybody in the broadcast world, is if that content and that video is being originated from multicast or IP from the transmitter, is there a possibility we could just use the open internet and this AMT technology to provide an alternate path or an additional path? And I'm not aware of anybody who is looking at both of these together, and I'd love to talk to somebody and ask questions, and maybe I'm way off base, but if you know anybody in the ATSC world, I'd love to talk to them.
Yeah, another, so that's a great point about the CDN stuff. with Akamai, and Andrew kind of brought that up earlier, Akamai is interested in this technology. You know, one would say, why would Akamai want to do this? After all, CDNs kind of exist to distribute content more efficiently for folks who can't. And the answer is, you know, the Akamai, you know, you've talked to Jake, he'll tell you that they look at these numbers that I started with. And he, you know, he talked at Nanog a couple weeks ago. You look at these numbers, and yes, video is working fine now, but if you look at the numbers and the way it's scaling, building something that would scale better would certainly be helpful for Akamai, and that's why they're investing in this technology. You know, they of all people would seem to be the types of folks that would want to keep the unicast paradigm, because that's kind of good for business. But they know and understand that, you know, something that scales better is going to be good for them too.
Okay. It does not look like we have any other questions that are outstanding right now. If anybody does have any others, please type them in. So while we wait for that, I'll thank you both again. If you can send me the copy of the slides, I'll make sure that those get posted along with the video from today. All right, looks like we may be out of questions. So thank you again, guys, for doing that. For those that are still on, we're not going to have a talk next week because of the holiday, but we're going to pick up again on July 10th. And I do not remember the topic right now, but I'll send out email on the mailing list to let people know what it is. So everybody have a good rest of your weekend and a good week next week, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Jason.